Hello, so we're at part 2. It is ineffective, the use of punishment. It is ineffective. And we're coming from Matthew chapter 18, verse 15 through 22. Matthew 18, 15 through 22. And before we get to the text, I want to share with you, kind of refresh your memory. Some of you have heard this reading articles and in magazines or just watching talk shows, listening to psychologists, public psychologists. A lot of this you'll be familiar with, but it's good to refresh as to why it is ineffective, the use of punishment. So in a 2019 recap of the science around punishment, published in the peer-reviewed journal American Psychologist, we find this assertion: there is still no evidence that physical punishment is effective or beneficial. There is still no evidence that physical punishment is effective or beneficial. And so they looked at a number of studies across race and ethnicity, parenting style, and neighborhoods, and the studies collectively found that physical punishment is linked with detrimental outcomes for all children, regardless of context. Now, I know you're thinking, my mom spanked me this thing, we say this in our community. We want the good old days when, we were passed from person to person and got a spanking for misdeeds. Well, it's important to know the other side of that as many as 88% of the people that we put in cages were physically punished to an extreme. And so this valorization of beating is straight off, very dangerous hierarchies about parent-child relationships, master-slave relationships, male-female relationships. It's not the best that humanity or our divinity has to offer. So that's what's going on in the psychological literature. And then there's this famous psychiatrist named Carl Menninger, who wrote a book called The Crime of Punishment. The Crime of Punishment. And he says that our insistence on punishment is our crime against criminals and our crime against ourselves. So in part 1, the use of punishment, the purposes of punishment, it is unnecessary. The purpose of punishment. We talked about how punishment is degradation, and it requires the person who's doing the punishment, or the state, or the locality, whatever, whomever, to be in a position of superiority, and to assume a position of superiority, and it is dysfunctional. And Menninger, this famous psychiatrist, says that this is criminal. The way we treat so-called criminals is criminal. So we are criminals. And he says one of his principles is that crime is not a disease, it is an illness, something that causes discomfort in the person of the criminal as well as the social body. It is a discomfort that is brought forward as a problem for physicians to solve. And so it is a grave injustice, he says, when the drive for punishment destroys the conditions for effective treatment. The drive for punishment destroys the conditions for effective treatment. Think about this in your own life, your experiences in your family. Punishment is summarized here as the delivery of painful consequences. And again, theologian Dr. Samuel Logan says punishment is basically degradation. And the delivery of painful consequences occurs through degradation. One reform-minded critical thinker says that men come to prison as a punishment, not for punishment. The loss of liberty is punishment enough, and then we add to that segregation, separation from children and family members, and we create inhumane conditions on top of the punishment of losing your freedom. Menninger goes on to say that the legal and psychiatric professions have perpetuated a ritual of show rather than any real intention of helping solve problems. He also says that the desire to match violence with violence is the central impediment of humane treatment in a prison, and it gets in the way of any attempts at re-education, therapy, or rehabilitation. So then, his motto was that of a caring physician, saying that just as doctors charge fees, they impose certain penalties or prices, they have put away the primitive idea of retaliating against patients that are offensive. And so that today a patient may cough in the doctor's face, vomit on the office rug, he may curse or scream or even struggle in the extremity of his pain, but these acts are not punished. Doctors and nurses have no time or thought for inflicting unnecessary pain, even upon patients who may be difficult, disagreeable, provocative, and even dangerous. It is their duty to care for them, he says, to try to make them well and to prevent them from doing themselves or others harm. This requires love, not hate. And the same thing is true in the case of trying to solve social problems and conflicts and harm when sin or crime occurs between us. That we should have the attitude of a caring physician as a society. And as you'll see when we get to scripture, that holds up in terms of one-on-one relationships. Menninger envisioned police as trained in conflict resolution and mental health principles. And he thought it was central to have a community safety center that would take the place of putting people in jail and segregating them away from their families. He wanted to see us be able to handle our problems without imprisonment. And the neat thing about Menninger is that he wrote his book in 1968. 2 or 3 years before hyper-incarceration took off. And he was going all over the country and promoting this way to reform mental health and prisons. So we are still in the dark ages as healers here in this country and around the globe. So then we go to the passage in scripture, which says, if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. So then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. And this, remember Jesus is using, his scriptures are the Hebrew scriptures. So forgiveness required atonement. So it's not just about letting someone off the hook. We are supposed to repair each other when the harm is done. And Peter would have understood that, which meant each time the person he forgave would also be repairing him each time. It's a process, and that's another talk. But notice Jesus teaches us not to punish one another, but to reconcile and forgive through atonement. The person atones. And what psychologists tell us, we're wrapping up now, what psychologists tell us is that love builds brains. And so that babies that have adequate attachment to their parents because they feel safe and secure will develop stronger brain connections. And so it requires intensive interaction. And we're in a microwave society, and these relationships are so important to build in order to create that security for each other and for our children that we're raising. So back to the neighborhood where everybody spanks you when you get in trouble. It wasn't the spanking that was working. The punishment was not effective. It was your love. It was the love in the community, right? It was sufficient amount of love that your child actually self-corrected because he or she wanted your love back. It looked like the spanking worked, but it was because you had a loving parent or loving community, and you self-corrected is what we have come to understand, what I have come to understand, what the literature is saying as well. And so when we take away enough parental and community love and all we do is physical punishment, we create aggressive children, aggressive adults, because we're just children in grown-up bodies. And so we need the Lord's teachings more, just as much today as ever before, but if we ever needed the Lord before, we sure do need him now. We have had a year to reflect on some of the most important tenets of our faith. And punishment is not a tenet of our faith. And how we as Christians got to be so punitive over the last 2,000 years is the work of spiritual warfare. Because that's not what Jesus taught us to do. So, it is ineffective. The use of punishment is ineffective. Part 3 on Easter Day. Have a good night. I'm getting this up on Monday, Thursday. It's a little late, but I did get it up. And may your day tomorrow, Friday, Good Friday, be filled with new revelations and insights about the Passion of Christ as we enter the weekend.